The locksmith wouldn't meet my eyes, as he installed the final deadbolt on the front door of my childhood home. I watched his hands work quickly, efficiently, like this was just another Tuesday afternoon job for him. Behind him, my Aunt Patricia stood with her arms folded across her chest, wearing that expression I'd seen her use on restaurant servers who got her order wrong. "We all agreed this would be best for everyone, Louisa," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You bring too much drama into this house. It's not healthy for any of us." The word drama hung in the air between us like an accusation. My suitcase sat open on the gravel driveway, my clothes hastily thrown inside by my cousin Tyler just an hour ago. My childhood bedroom, the one with the window seat where Dad used to read me bedtime stories, had already been stripped completely bare. Someone laughed softly from the porch, a cruel little sound that cut through the afternoon silence. I turned and saw Tyler smirking at me, his phone pointed in my direction. He was recording this whole thing. I realized, standing there with the afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders, that this wasn't a family discussion or an intervention. This was an eviction. And they were documenting it like some kind of victory. Patricia said the word drama like it was a terminal diagnosis, something dangerous that needed to be quarantined before it infected everyone else. "Ever since your father passed away, you've been absolutely impossible to deal with," she continued, smoothing down her perfectly styled blonde hair. "The constant crying, the endless questions, the need for attention every single minute. We've all been incredibly patient with you, but frankly, enough is enough now." I hadn't been crying that much. I'd been grieving, yes, but mostly I'd been asking questions about the estate. Questions about Dad's wishes, about why certain decisions were being made so quickly, about why I wasn't being included in important discussions. Apparently, wanting to understand what was happening to my father's legacy qualified as dramatic behavior. My Uncle Bernard stepped forward from the porch, his expensive Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel. "Your aunt is absolutely right, Louisa. This house desperately needs peace and stability, and quite honestly, you're disrupting both. We are actually doing this for your own good too. You need space to heal properly." I wanted to laugh at that twisted logic. Space to heal. They were throwing me out of my childhood home 3 months after my father died, and somehow they'd convinced themselves this was therapeutic. The estate manager, Mr. Phillips, stood near his car pretending to check his phone. He'd known me since I was 6 years old. Now he couldn't even look at me. My cousins lined up along the porch railing like spectators at some twisted sporting event. Tyler with his phone still recording everything. His sister Melissa examining her perfectly manicured nails like this whole situation bored her. Their younger brother Cameron at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but clearly not uncomfortable enough to actually speak up in my defense. Bernard's daughter Vanessa stood with her arms crossed, wearing the exact same cold expression as her father. Not a single one of them said anything to stop this. These were people I'd grown up with, people I'd spent every holiday and summer vacation with, people who used to beg me to play board games and swim in the pool with them when we were children. Now they watched in complete silence, as I was removed from my own home like I was unwanted furniture being hauled to the curb. "Does anyone want to say anything?" I asked quietly, looking directly at each of them in turn. Melissa finally glanced up from her nails. "Lou, you know this really isn't personal or anything. It's just, well, you've been incredibly difficult to be around lately. We are all trying to move forward." Difficult. I'd been grieving my father. I'd been trying desperately to understand why everything was happening so fast. Apparently, that made me difficult. Cameron shifted his weight uncomfortably, but kept his mouth firmly shut. I nodded slowly, understanding everything perfectly now. They'd all already chosen their side, and it definitely wasn't mine. My entire life, everything I'd accumulated over 28 years of existence, had been reduced to what could fit inside 2 battered suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. I stared at the pathetic pile sitting on the driveway, such a small collection for nearly 3 decades of living. My clothes, some books I'd managed to grab, a handful of framed photographs. They'd actually let me take the photos, which I suppose they thought was generous of them. Everything else, they'd informed me very clearly, belonged to the estate now. My grandmother's antique jewelry collection, that she'd explicitly promised would be mine someday. Estate property. The custom-built desk Dad had made for my 16th birthday with his own hands. Estate property. The extensive collection of first edition books we'd spent years carefully gathering together at estate sales and auctions. Estate property. I'd asked specifically about my father's personal papers, the important files from his study that he'd always kept meticulously organized in those distinctive brown leather folders. Those definitely belonged to the estate, Bernard had said with absolute firmness. Financial records, legal documents, business correspondence, it's all official estate business now. I remembered Dad's study so vividly, the comforting smell of old leather-bound books and sweet pipe tobacco, the way he'd let me sit in his oversized leather chair while he worked at his desk. He'd always said I had a naturally good head for details, better than anyone else in the entire family. Standing there watching my packed bags, I wondered if somehow he'd known this day would eventually come. I didn't argue with them. I didn't scream or cry or beg them to reconsider their decision. I just stood there completely still, watching them watch me, waiting patiently for the inevitable breakdown they all clearly expected. Patricia kept glancing nervously at Bernard, like they were both waiting for me to give them the big dramatic scene that would perfectly justify everything they were doing. "You're taking this surprisingly well," Melissa called out from the porch, and I could hear genuine confusion in her voice. "I honestly thought you'd be way more upset about all this." I met her eyes steadily. Would it actually change anything if I was upset? The question hung in the air, completely unanswered. Tyler lowered his phone slightly, his smirk beginning to fade from his face. Even Bernard looked uncertain for just a brief moment, like my unnatural calm was somehow more unsettling to him than tears and hysterics would have been. The truth was simple. I'd learned something incredibly important from my father during those final difficult months before he died. He'd told me once, during one of our late-night conversations in his study when the pain was particularly bad, that the people who react the loudest are very rarely the ones who actually win in the end. Real power, he'd said, gripping my hand tightly, comes from knowing exactly when to be quiet and when to take action. So I stayed completely quiet. I let them think I was defeated and broken, let them believe they'd won. It was so much easier that way. And besides, I had important questions that desperately needed answers, and screaming at them wouldn't provide any of those answers. My name is Louisa Catherine Grant, and I'm 28 years old. I was born in the house they just locked me out of, in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor during an unexpected late spring snowstorm that kept the doctor from arriving on time. My mother died when I was only 3 years old, ovarian cancer, terrifyingly quick and impossibly cruel. After that devastating loss, it was just Dad and me living in that enormous house, along with the extended family members who visited regularly during holidays and special occasions. Dad raised me there with incredible patience and love. He taught me to read in the mahogany-paneled library, to swim confidently in the estate pool, to genuinely appreciate rare old books and expensive whiskey, and the critical importance of always keeping your word. He taught me everything about the family business, about smart investments and careful property management, and the complex trust that had kept the Grant family financially comfortable for 3 full generations. Most importantly, he taught me to pay extremely close attention to details that other people consistently ignored or dismissed as unimportant. "The devil's always in the details, Lou," he used to say, tapping his finger firmly on whatever document we happened to be reviewing together. "And so is your protection." I was his daughter, his only child, the one who sat quietly beside him during long boring estate meetings while my cousins played outside. The one he trusted completely with passwords and filing systems and the exact location of important papers. They all thought that made me his spoiled little princess. None of them ever wondered if it might actually mean something much more significant. The Grant estate wasn't just a house or a family home. It was 12 carefully maintained acres of prime real estate in Westchester County, a beautiful stone mansion originally built in 1924 by my great-grandfather, and a substantial trust fund that had been expertly managed through 3 complete generations. The property itself was worth several $1 million. Add in the diversified investment portfolio, the commercial real estate holdings scattered across 3 states, and the various business interests, and you were looking at genuinely serious money. Serious enough that people got very interested very quickly when the person controlling everything suddenly died. My father, Jonathan Alexander Grant, had served as the sole trustee after my grandfather passed away 15 years ago. He'd managed absolutely everything with incredible care, made consistently smart investments, kept the entire family living comfortably. And he'd done all of it from his beloved study in that house, surrounded by tall filing cabinets and leather-bound ledgers, and his extensive collection of legal documents. The estate had been in our family for almost an entire century now. Every single Grant child had grown up there, running through the exact same hallways, hiding in the exact same closets, learning the exact same family stories and traditions. It was so much more than just property. It was legacy, history, connection. That's why it felt so fundamentally wrong, standing in that driveway while complete strangers changed the locks on my childhood home. This wasn't just my house. It was my entire history, my direct connection to everyone who came before me. And they were raising me from it like I'd never even existed at all. Dad got sick 18 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the absolute worst kind that doesn't give you much time or many options. The doctors initially said maybe 6 months if we were lucky, and he made it to 14 months, pure stubbornness and determination, his oncologist said with genuine admiration. During those incredibly difficult 14 months, something significant changed in our relationship. He started insisting that I sit in on absolutely every meeting with his lawyers, every single discussion with the estate manager, every detailed review of the family finances. "Pay very close attention, Lou," he'd say seriously, pushing important papers across his desk toward me. "I need you to understand exactly how all of this works." My aunt and uncle thought it was touching, Dad trying to keep me involved and engaged during his terrible illness. They didn't notice at all that he was actually teaching me, deliberately and carefully, exactly how the entire estate operated. He showed me precisely where documents were filed, how the trust was legally structured, what specific provisions existed for different potential situations. He made me organize his papers, create detailed backup files, learn the complex systems that absolutely no one else in the family ever bothered with. "You're the only one who genuinely cares about details," he told me once, during one of the really bad nights when the pain was completely overwhelming. "Everyone else just cares about final results." 3 weeks before he died, he made me promise him something important. "If anything feels wrong after I'm gone, check the documents carefully. All of them. The truth is always in the paperwork, Lou. Always." The will was officially read just 6 days after the funeral. Looking back now with clear eyes, that should have been my very first warning sign. Dad died on a Tuesday morning. We buried him that Friday afternoon. The following Wednesday, everyone gathered in Bernard's lawyer's downtown office for the official reading. 6 days total. Most estates take weeks or even months to properly settle, but apparently ours was somehow extremely urgent. I sat in that sterile office, still completely numb from grief, while the lawyer, a man I'd never seen before in my life, definitely not Dad's longtime trusted attorney, read through the document surprisingly quickly. The Grant estate and all associated assets would be held in trust, managed by a board consisting of Bernard, Patricia, and the estate manager, Mr. Phillips. Standard provisions for family members living on the property. Reasonable distributions to maintain the grounds and cover ongoing expenses. And my father's personal effects and papers would be retained by the estate for official record-keeping purposes. I'd asked why Dad's longtime attorney wasn't handling any of this. Mr. Harrison retired last year, Bernard explained smoothly. Your father had been working with our firm on updating his entire estate planning. That seemed genuinely odd to me. Dad had trusted Harrison completely for decades. But I was too deep in grief to argue effectively, too exhausted to ask all the right questions. I signed exactly where they told me to sign, listened while they explained it was all very standard procedure, accepted their reassurances that everything was being handled properly and legally. I didn't know yet that I should have demanded to see every single page, every clause, every provision. I learned that critical lesson later. They assumed grief had completely broken me, made me soft and easily manageable. In those first terrible weeks after Dad died, I cried constantly. I stayed in my room for days. I didn't argue when they made quick decisions about the funeral arrangements, the estate management, the family business. I let them think I was too devastated to care about any practical matters. And they absolutely loved it. Finally, Louisa was behaving appropriately, showing proper emotion, not asking her usual complicated questions about everything. Patricia actually hugged me tightly at the funeral and whispered, "It's perfectly okay to fall apart, sweetheart. Just let us handle all the difficult things for you." I nodded against her shoulder, smelling her expensive French perfume, and didn't mention that Dad had already taught me everything about those difficult things she assumed I couldn't handle. Bernard started making significant changes almost immediately. New investment strategies, selling off some properties, bringing in expensive consultants to modernize the family portfolio. When I asked simple questions about these decisions, he patted my hand condescendingly. "Don't worry yourself about business matters right now, Lou. Just focus on healing." They saw exactly what they wanted to see. A grieving 28-year-old who'd lost her only parent, too emotional to notice what was actually happening around her. They didn't see that I was watching everything carefully, noting every decision, every quick conversation that ended abruptly when I entered a room, every document they thought I was too distracted to request. Dad had taught me extremely well. And he taught me that sometimes the very best disguise was just the truth. So I grieved openly and honestly while watching quietly and carefully. The storage unit was legally in Dad's name, rented monthly, located 40 minutes away from the estate in a facility I'd never even heard of before. I only knew about it because I'd found the key in a small box of his personal effects they'd reluctantly let me keep. A single silver key, with a number stamped on it and an address written on an attached tag in Dad's distinctive handwriting. The tag said simply, "Just in case, Lou, check section C." I'd driven out there 2 weeks after the funeral, not knowing at all what I'd find. The unit was relatively small, 10 by 10 feet, filled completely with cardboard boxes and metal filing cabinets. No furniture, no valuable antiques, just papers. So many papers. Financial records going back 20 years. Legal documents. Official correspondence. Files carefully labeled with specific dates and names and case numbers. At first, I'd thought maybe this was just overflow from his study, things he'd moved out to make more space. But as I started opening boxes systematically, I realized this wasn't overflow at all. This was deliberate preservation. These were copies of absolutely everything important, meticulously organized and dated, with detailed notes in Dad's handwriting explaining context and significance. He'd been building a complete backup archive, protecting documents that someone might want to make disappear. And he'd made absolutely sure I could find it. Just in case, the tag had said. In case of what? I'd wondered at the time. Now, standing in my driveway with my suitcases packed, I understood completely. In case of exactly this. The binder was dark blue leather, thick as a dictionary, with my father's distinctive handwriting on the spine, Primary Trust Documents master copy. I'd found it in one of the filing cabinets during my second visit to the storage unit, and something about it had made me pause immediately. This wasn't just another random file. This was the file, the one Dad had labeled and protected like it was sacred. Inside were copies of absolutely everything related to the Grant family trust, dating all the way back to when my great-grandfather had originally established it in 1925. Amendments, revisions, legal opinions, trustee appointments. Every single significant document, organized chronologically, with Dad's careful notes in the margins. I'd spent hours reading through it, trying to understand the complex legal language, following the thread of how the trust had evolved over decades. Most of it was standard estate planning, provisions for property management, distribution of assets, succession of trustees. But then I found something that made me sit up perfectly straight in that cold storage unit, my breath visible in the air. A provision added in 1983 by my grandfather, updated in 2007 by my father. It was buried in Section 7, subsection D, written in that dense legal language that makes your eyes glaze over. But once I understood what it actually said, I couldn't stop reading it. Over and over again, making absolutely sure I wasn't misinterpreting, wasn't seeing what I wanted to see. This changed everything. The clause was titled Occupancy Rights and Beneficiary Protections. According to the provision, any direct descendant of the original trustee, who had continuously resided on the estate property for a minimum of 15 years, was entitled to maintain primary residence rights unless they voluntarily vacated or violated specific terms outlined in Appendix F. The language was careful and precise. It didn't matter who the current trustee was or what the general will said about asset distribution. This was a separate, protected provision specifically designed to prevent family members from being arbitrarily displaced from their ancestral home. I'd lived in that house my entire life. 28 years of continuous residence, well over the 15-year minimum requirement. And according to Appendix F, the only valid reasons I could be removed were criminal activity, intentional property destruction, or voluntary departure. Being dramatic didn't qualify anywhere. My grandfather had added this provision after a bitter family dispute in the 1980s, when one of his brothers had tried to force elderly relatives out of a family property. Dad had updated it in 2007, strengthening the language and clarifying the terms even further. He'd protected it, maintained it, and never mentioned it to the current trustees. They'd read the recent will, but they clearly hadn't studied the full trust document. They'd seen what they wanted to see and ignored 90 years of legal foundation. The trust was the skeleton, the will was just the latest outfit it was wearing. And they'd changed the locks on a door they didn't actually control. I called Mr. Phillips on Monday morning, 3 days after they'd evicted me. I'd been staying in a cheap hotel near the highway, spending my days in the storage unit reading through every single document I could find. Mr. Phillips, it's Louisa Grant. I need to schedule a meeting with you. His voice sounded tired and strained. Louisa, I don't think that's appropriate right now. Your family has made their decision, and I need to respect. I need to discuss some provisions in the primary trust document, I interrupted calmly. Specifically regarding occupancy rights under Section 7, subsection D. The silence that followed told me absolutely everything I needed to know. He'd either never read that section, or he'd forgotten it existed. I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to, he said finally, but his voice had changed completely. Less certain. The master copy should be in the estate files. I assume you have access to it. More silence. Then, let me check the documents and get back to you. I'll be at your office Wednesday at 2 o'clock, I said pleasantly. I have my own copies of the relevant sections if you need them. I hung up before he could argue. It felt good, that small assertion of control. I wasn't asking permission. I wasn't begging. I was simply informing him of what was about to happen. Dad had taught me that tone mattered. Sound uncertain, and people treat you like a child. Sound confident, and they start questioning their own assumptions. Mr. Phillips called back Tuesday afternoon. Louisa, I've been reviewing the documents you mentioned. I think we should definitely meet. However, I'd like to request more time to thoroughly examine the full trust before our meeting. The pause in his voice was telling. He was stalling, probably calling Bernard and Patricia right now, warning them that there might be a problem. Of course, I said smoothly. Would Friday work better? Friday would be perfect. And Louisa, should I expect anyone else to join us? He was asking if I was bringing a lawyer. I wasn't, not yet. Lawyers made people defensive, turned conversations into confrontations. Right now, I wanted information and observation, not conflict. Just me, I replied. Unless you think others should be present. Another pause. Let me handle that on my end. He was going to tell Bernard and Patricia. Good. I wanted them worried. I wanted them digging through documents they'd never bothered to read, discovering that their quick eviction might have been premature. I wanted them to feel the first tremor of uncertainty. The power in this situation wasn't the documents themselves. It was the knowledge that I had them, that I'd been prepared when they thought I was helpless, that I understood the system they'd taken for granted. Dad used to say that information was only powerful if you knew when to reveal it. Too early, and people had time to counter. Too late, and the opportunity passed. The timing had to be perfect. Friday would be perfect. While waiting for Friday, I went back through the storage unit files and found something else interesting. An email chain between Dad and Mr. Phillips from 2 years ago. Dad had sent detailed instructions about maintaining the trust's original provisions during any state updates. It's critical that the foundational clauses remain intact, he'd written. These protections exist for a reason, and I need your assurance that they won't be modified or overlooked. Mr. Phillips had responded with assurances, promising that any updates would preserve the trust's protective provisions. But somewhere between those promises and Dad's death, something had gone wrong. The will had been read quickly, focused only on recent amendments. The full trust document, the one with all those protective clauses, had apparently been filed away without review. Either Mr. Phillips had forgotten Dad's instructions, or someone had convinced him those old provisions didn't matter anymore. I printed the entire email chain, added it to my growing folder of documentation. This wasn't just about legal rights anymore. This was about negligence, about disregarding explicit instructions from the person who'd trusted you to manage his legacy. I didn't want to destroy Mr. Phillips. He'd been kind to me as a child, had genuinely cared about my father. But he needed to understand that his oversight had consequences, and that I wasn't going to politely ignore them. The receipts were piling up, old provisions, ignored emails, hasty decisions. All documented, all dated, all undeniable. The more I dug, the clearer it became. When Bernard and Patricia changed the locks, they'd made a critical mistake. According to the trust, any modifications to primary residence access required approval from the designated occupant, unless that occupant had violated the specific terms in Appendix F. They'd changed locks without checking if they had the legal authority to do so. They'd assumed the recent will gave them that power, but the trust superseded the will on property matters. They'd been so focused on removing me quickly, before I could ask more questions or cause more drama, that they'd skipped basic legal due diligence. In their rush to assert control, they'd violated the very document that gave them trustee authority. It was almost beautiful in its simplicity. They'd locked me out of a house they didn't technically control when it came to my residence rights. And they'd done it publicly, in front of witnesses, with Tyler recording it on his phone. I had evidence of the eviction. I had the trust document proving it was improper. I had emails showing the estate manager had been explicitly instructed to protect these provisions. The case built itself. I didn't need to fabricate anything or stretch the truth. I just needed to present what already existed, what they'd been too arrogant or too careless to examine. Dad's voice echoed in my memory, "The devil's in the details, Lou. And so is your protection." He'd built that protection years ago, and I was standing inside it. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Friday at 2, but I received a text from Mr. Phillips Thursday night saying they'd moved it to 10 o'clock instead. "Several parties need to be present," he wrote. I wasn't surprised. They'd found the provision. They'd realized their mistake. Now they were scrambling. I arrived at Mr. Phillips' office at exactly 9:55 a.m. Friday morning, carrying my blue leather binder and a folder of supporting documents. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when she saw me. "They are already in the conference room, Ms. Grant. But Mr. Phillips asked if you could wait here for just a few minutes." They were meeting without me first, planning their strategy. I settled into a leather chair in the waiting area and smiled pleasantly. "Of course. I'll be right here." Through the conference room's frosted glass door, I could see shapes moving, hear the murmur of urgent voices. Bernard's voice rose once, sharp and angry, before someone shushed him quickly. I checked my phone, scrolled through messages, projected calm. At 10:17, the conference room door opened. Mr. Phillips stepped out, looking 20 years older than he had a week ago. "Louisa, we are ready for you now." The conference room held Bernard, Patricia, Vanessa, and a woman I didn't recognize in an expensive suit, their attorney, clearly. They all watched me enter, their expressions ranging from Bernard's barely concealed fury to Patricia's forced pleasantness. I took the empty seat at the table, placed my binder in front of me, and waited. I didn't open with accusations. I didn't bring up the eviction, or the changed locks, or being called dramatic. Instead, I pulled out a copy of Section 7, subsection D, and slid it across the table to their attorney. "I thought we should review this provision before discussing anything else," I said calmly. My father always emphasized the importance of understanding the full trust document. Their attorney read it once, then again, her expression carefully neutral. But I saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the way she glanced at Bernard. She understood immediately. Bernard tried to bluster. This is an old provision from my father's time. It doesn't supersede the current. It was updated in 2007 by my father, I interrupted gently. And according to trust law, specific provisions supersede general ones, especially regarding property rights. But I'm sure your attorney can explain that better than I can. I wasn't accusing anyone of malice or conspiracy. I was simply presenting documentation and letting the legal reality speak for itself. That was another thing Dad taught me, let the evidence carry the weight. If you sound angry, people dismiss you as emotional. If you sound calm and present facts, they have to engage with the substance. I pulled out the email chain next. I also found this correspondence between my father and Mr. Phillips regarding the preservation of trust provisions. It seems there may have been an oversight in the recent review. Mr. Phillips looked like he wanted to disappear. Patricia's face had gone very pale. Only Vanessa looked openly angry, but she was smart enough to stay quiet. I watched my uncle's face change, the progression from confidence to confusion to dawning horror. He'd been so certain, so comfortable in his authority as trustee. Now that authority was crumbling in front of him, and he didn't know how to stop it. This is ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You can't possibly think. I think my father built in protections for a reason, I said quietly. And I think those protections should be honored. Their attorney leaned forward. Ms. Grant, perhaps we could discuss a compromise. Some arrangement that works for everyone. I met her eyes. I lived in that house my entire life. It's my home. I wasn't consulted before being removed, and according to the trust, I should have been. I'm not looking for a fight. I'm looking for what's already mine under the existing legal framework. Patricia tried a different approach. Louisa, sweetheart, we had no idea about this provision. We were trying to do what we thought was best. If we'd known, you would have read the full trust document before changing the locks. I asked. Or you would have asked me questions instead of assuming grief made me incompetent. The room went very quiet. This was the moment they realized I wasn't the devastated girl from the driveway. I was my father's daughter, and he'd taught me well. Bernard tried one more time. We're family. Surely we can work this out privately without acknowledging that you violated the trust. I finished. I'm happy to work this out. But it needs to start with recognition of what actually happened. The trust attorney, the one who'd originally established the family trust decades ago, and still served as official trustee advisor, arrived an hour later. Mr. Phillips had called him during our meeting, and he'd driven up from the city immediately. His name was Howard Blackwell, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer my great-grandfather would have chosen, methodical, unimpressed by emotion, and completely devoted to the letter of the law. He read Section 7, subsection D slowly, then asked to see my documentation of continuous residence. I provided my driver's license, tax records showing the estate as my primary address, utility bills in my name. He reviewed everything without comment, then turned to Bernard. When did you change the property locks? Last Wednesday, Bernard admitted. And was Miss Grant consulted or notified in advance? Silence. Mr. Blackwell nodded slowly. The provision is quite clear. Unless Ms. Grant violated one of the conditions specified in Appendix F, and I see no evidence of that, her residence rights are protected. The recent will doesn't override this trust provision. Changing the locks without her consent, or a qualifying violation was improper. He said it without drama, without accusation, just stating fact. But in that conference room, his words landed like a verdict. Bernard's face flushed red. Patricia looked at her lawyer, who shrugged helplessly. We'll need to rectify this immediately, Mr. Blackwell continued. The locks should be restored to Ms. Grant's access, and the board should formally acknowledge her residence rights under the trust. He wasn't asking. He was instructing. And nobody argued. The keys were returned to me that afternoon, along with a formal letter from the trustee board acknowledging my residence rights under the trust. No apology. No admission of wrongdoing beyond administrative oversight. Just the keys and the letter, handed over by Mr. Phillips in his office while Bernard and Patricia waited in their car outside. "I'm sorry, Louisa," Mr. Phillips said quietly. "I should have reviewed the full trust before approving the lock change. Your father trusted me to protect these provisions, and I failed. I took the keys, felt their familiar weight in my palm. You can make it right going forward," I said. "That's what matters now." He nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't pushing for more. And I wasn't, not from him. He'd been negligent, not malicious. Bernard and Patricia were different. They'd been eager to remove me, quick to dismiss my grief as drama. But even with them, I didn't want revenge. I wanted acknowledgement, and I had it. The letter in my hand proved it. By 5 o'clock that evening, I was back at the estate. The new locks had been removed, my original keys worked perfectly. I stood in the foyer, breathing in the familiar smell of old wood and leather, and felt something inside me settle. This was my home. My history. My father's legacy. And now it was protected, not by anger or fighting, but by the careful preparation he'd built years ago. Dad had known. Somehow, he'd known that one day I might need these protections, and he'd made sure they existed. The devil's in the details. And so is your protection. They moved out within the month, though technically they'd never moved in. Bernard and Patricia had been living in their own houses, just visiting the estate for meetings and family gatherings. But after the keys were returned, those visits stopped completely. No more family dinners in the formal dining room. No more strategy sessions in Dad's study. They stayed away, and I didn't push them to visit. Vanessa sent me an email 2 weeks later, brief and cold. "I hope you're satisfied with yourself. You've destroyed this family's unity." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They'd tried to erase me from my own home, and when I'd used the protections my father built, they called it destruction. The trust meetings continued, but now they happened in Mr. Phillips' office, and I attended every single one. Bernard and Patricia could barely look at me, but they couldn't exclude me either. I was a beneficiary, a resident, protected by provisions they'd ignored. Slowly, the estate returned to something like peace. I hired a new groundskeeper, updated some outdated systems, went through Dad's study and finally sorted his papers properly. The house felt different without him, quieter and sadder. But it was still mine. Still home. And I'd protected it the way he'd protected me, with preparation, documentation, and the patience to let the truth speak for itself. 6 months after getting the keys back, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Mr. Blackwell, the trust attorney, and told him I wanted to discuss transferring the estate to a conservation trust. Not selling it, not giving it to Bernard and Patricia, but preserving it as a historical property that future generations could visit and learn from. The house has been in our family for almost a century, I explained. But it's bigger than any one person or branch of the family. It should be protected for what it represents, not just who owns it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant decision, Louisa. You'd be giving up primary residence rights. I'd be ensuring those rights could never be weaponized again, I corrected. And I'd be honoring what my father really cared about, legacy, not possession. The process took months. legal reviews, property assessments, establishing the terms of the conservation trust. Bernard and Patricia initially opposed it, but they had no legal grounds to interfere. The decision was mine to make under the same provisions that had protected my residence. When the paperwork was finalized, the Grant estate became a historic property managed by a preservation foundation. I maintained residence rights for my lifetime, but after that, it would be preserved as a museum and educational site. Family members could visit but not claim ownership. Future generations would learn the history without fighting over the inheritance. It wasn't the outcome anyone expected. But it was right. And it was mine to choose. They called me dramatic. They said I brought chaos and disruption, that I needed to be removed for the good of the family. They changed locks and packed my bags and assumed grief had made me helpless and manageable. What they didn't know was that my father had spent years teaching me that real strength wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about being prepared. Real power wasn't about controlling others. It was about understanding the systems that controlled everyone. I didn't come back with lawyers screaming and media attention and public spectacles. I came back with paperwork, the boring, detailed, carefully preserved paperwork that my father had taught me to value above everything else. Documents they'd never bothered to read, provisions they'd assumed were obsolete, protections built by people who'd learned hard lessons about family and legacy. They thought removing me would be easy, that I'd simply disappear and let them reshape the estate in their image. They learned differently. Not through drama or confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable weight of legal reality. In the end, the lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about preparation. About trusting that the people who love you will protect you, even after they are gone. About understanding that the most powerful weapon isn't the one that makes the most noise. My father taught me to read the fine print, to keep records, to value truth over comfort. He taught me that if someone removes you to stay comfortable, you let them. You just make sure you're holding the paperwork when they realize comfort was never the real asset. The keys sit on my desk now, next to a photo of Dad in his study. I don't need to use them to prove anything anymore. Their weight is enough,